Welcome to the CTA podcast. Join us as we critically examine the ideological capture of the psychotherapy field. Here we discuss better, common humanity proposals for a fairer society. Our discussions are thought-provoking, and our guests are from diverse backgrounds, bringing unique perspectives to the table. This is the CTA podcast with your hosts Jaco van Zyl and Christine Siefen. So we're very excited to have as our guest this afternoon Ben Harris. Ben Harris is a psychotherapist in private practice in London. He studied philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford, and he later pursued a career in psychotherapy. And he practices predominantly from psychoanalytic, Jungian, and existentialist perspectives, and I could see that in your chapter. So Ben is an author of a very exciting new book that has been released recently. The book's title is Cynical Therapies, Perspectives on the Anti-Therapeutic Nature of Critical Social Justice. Quite a provocative title. So, psychoanalytic, Jungian, and existentialist perspectives. That's my food, man. Just before we go into the nitty-gritty of your chapter, I have to say that what I appreciate about the book is how accessible it is. It is technically sound enough for professionals to appreciate, but I think the language is used to such an extent that people in general would find the information quite accessible and understandable, and I think that is a good achievement. All of the authors have actually done well on. How about you just tell us something about yourself? What made you decide? Why psychotherapy? What's wrong with you?
Well, that's the question, is what's wrong with you? What's wrong with the three of us? How about that?
Yeah, let's compare notes.
Any group of psychotherapists that gathers together, that is always the question, I think, isn't it? Well, I mean, why does anyone become a psychotherapist? I mean, to put it in the broadest of senses possible, yes, it was contact with my own pain and the need to go and do some therapy myself. So I had spent most of my 20s working in the City of London in one form or another. So I was a corporate analyst looking at company structures for a while, and then I was a lawyer for a city firm, and it all made me rather miserable, and I found the work. It's a funny thing, isn't it? You might normally think that people might find something either boring or anxiety provoking, but I managed to find it both boring and anxiety provoking. So that was a real feather in my cap, I thought. So I went off and did some personal therapy, and I thought, wow, this is over the time I was doing it, I started to think, good Lord, this is having quite the impact on me. This is actually really powerful stuff, very powerful indeed, and that is what sent me off to go and do the training, which I did in London at the Minster Centre, which is one of the country's sort of most well-regarded training institutes for psychotherapists in the UK. And I suppose initially I was doing it as a form of self-exploration to sort of heal myself. I think that's how it starts for many of us, right? And now I've been practicing for some years.
Right. So you were suffering from what Viktor Frankl would have called noogenic neurosis, a neurosis of meaning, right? And then you decided to go into psychotherapy yourself, and there you found, there is a lot of meaning that I can pursue and share with psychotherapy. Right up your existentialist alley.
Yes, true. I'm trained integratively as Most of us are in the UK these days. But I suppose it's our personal experiences that lead us in one direction or another. I've always thought of myself, perhaps we'll come into this a little bit later, I've always thought of myself as a little bit cynical. And I think psychoanalysis operates within the kind of hermeneutics of suspicion. The idea of, well, what's really going on here? Not what's my story, but what's really going on. So I think that's what led me in that direction. And I think, my own experience of suffering helped me realize that, well, actually, those existential truths are all pretty relevant. You can't avoid them. You've got to kind of face them head on, I think.
Can you tell us a little bit about how that ties into what you wrote about regarding critical social justice?
I suppose, not to mince words, I have been fairly incredulous as to how there has been so little analysis of what this critical theory, critical social justice phenomenon is, why it's coming about, what it represents. Now, as Freud said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, but so it's not like I want to. It's not that I would say that there's nothing in what the critical social justice activists are saying. That's not my point, and I suspect it's not the point of a lot of other people either. My point is that there are always multiple intersecting methods by which you can analyze something, and just as we can see it as a kind of social movement that's trying to promote a kind of egalitarianism, trying to reduce suffering in the world, I think we can certainly also see it as having an awful lot of counterproductive side effects, whether intended or not. And I think the point is that, of course, when you think about things psychoanalytically, things can be both intended and unintended at exactly the same time. So that which is not intended consciously may well be intended unconsciously. So we've seen how this set of ideas has come to be wielded as a club, a kind of ideology of power, if you like, that has accrued power and legitimacy in favor of those who wield it, and has resulted in a lot of damage in many instances to those who have said, well, actually, hang on, I'm not quite sure if I agree with this, or I might agree with this and not with that. The kind of the intolerance, the lack of brooking any disagreement, I think, is one of the things I found most sort of flabbergasting about the whole thing. I'd started paying attention to this from about 2015. And it was, of course, I'm sure you've heard this from many other people as well, but it was, for me, it was Jordan Peterson was the canary in the coal mine. I was sort of reading these pieces in the kind of the middle of the newspaper, kind of buried away on pages 13 and 14, about this unknown Canadian professor who was being taken to some sort of state court or threatened with for not saying certain words, in this case pronouns. And I remember thinking at the time how extraordinary it was that in a kind of fellow democracy, a Commonwealth country, that somebody might potentially be kicked out of their job for being unwilling to say certain words, or we also might think of that as being unwilling to sign up to a particular ideological perspective. It's not what we expect from liberal countries. But again, I think we're sort of seeing that generally, that actually, I think critical social justice is, I would say, one phenomenon that is contributing to a wider, increasing sense of authoritarianism in the liberal democracies. It's a major one. Let's not go off topic, but I think it's part of a wider sort of social occurrence that I don't think I've got to the bottom of fully. I think a lot of us need to do more thinking about exactly what's happening and why. Initially I was seeing this happening in the culture at large, seeing it happening to this clinical psychologist, and then of course we started seeing this happening to our own psychological and psychotherapeutic professions elsewhere in the world.
Isn't it interesting? And I take your point. Isn't it interesting that there's been a deafening silence on the part of psychoanalysts to analyze what's going on, and that is the danger of subscribing to an ideology, of participating in an ideology, and of incorporating the same sentiments, the same blindnesses, and the same desires, unconscious desires endorsed by this ideology, that we lose our psychoanalytic position, that our psychoanalytic frame. It's as if psychoanalysts have not learned from history.
Yes, it's an interesting point. And yes, I've been struck by the fact, as you say, Jaco, that there's a sort of, it's interesting to me that from within our professions, one of the groups I think that has provided most sort of credence, or more credence perhaps than the average, to the ideology of critical social justice has been from the psychoanalytic wing of the profession.
Yes.
Now,
yes.
I suppose I sort of think that's partly to do with this idea of the hermeneutics of suspicion. Actually, you know, those of us who are psychoanalytically inclined, we tend to be a bit hangdog. We're sort of rather miserable. We have these sort of rather pessimistic views on the human condition and human nature. And of course, critical social justice has that as well. It has a very pessimistic view, certainly on the nature of sort of dominant groups, men, whites, able-bodied people, cisgender people, etc. Whoever is the dominant group is sort of seen through a rather negative lens. I'm sure some of that's fair, some of that's not.
Right.
You know, with shadow. But the point is that I think psychoanalysis was sort of perhaps parts of it were primed for this because of this hermeneutic of suspicion. Yes, well, actually, if you peel back the surface layer underneath, it's all about power and the kind of the maintenance of the dominant position of pre-existing dominant groups. Well, sure. I mean, I actually don't entirely disagree with that. Dominant groups tend to not want to cease to be dominant, but it depends how you define the groups. Critical social justice seems to have this idea that we're all sort of fixed in these blocks. Actually, people's identity is much more fluid in terms of, you know, how we seek to identify ourselves and which groups do we see ourselves as part of and which not.
Right. Especially group identity.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So, you know, yes, of course, conflict exists, but it's much more kind of nuanced. It's much more subjective and intersubjective than I think the viewpoint kind of offers. But of course, we can also view CSJ through a psychoanalytic lens rather than simply having a psychoanalytic lens informed by CSJ as well. And that's what I wanted to do in this chapter.
Precisely. That's returning the favor that you wrote about.
I want to ask you in your chapter. So a couple things, of course, that strike me about how you describe privilege. Before that, actually, this is Peter Lomas, right? The access to truth and bringing clients to that realization starts with the therapist and that coercion piece of critical social justice. Can you speak a little bit more about that? Because I think that's such a fascinating frame to understand what we're talking about, because being a professor and in that space of having the students really needing to focus on themselves and their own belief systems and how that gets transferred in the room, right, to the client. So can you talk a little bit more about that coercion part? You're bringing them to a realization based on what you personally believe, this ideological frame, rather than what the client needs to discover for themselves.
Yes, that's a very interesting point, because that's a side of things that I've not been involved in. So it is interesting to have that input. And you know, I think you pick up on a part of my chapter, Christine, that I think is extremely important from a you know, yes, there's a lot of theory in there, hopefully useful, but there's a kind of underlying a lot of this is the question of kind of morality and ethics. So what is an ethical stance?
Yes. Right.
And you know, Lomas, I've always liked Lomas. He's another cynic like me, and he's always suggested, you know, well, you know, if you're the therapist and you're saying you're having this great experience with this client and everything's so lovey-dovey and happy clappy, and you're a great healer and the client's a great client and you're having this amazing time together, his point is, well, you need to dig into that, because what is that actually about? What are you excluding? Now, I'm a psychotherapist. I'm also a human being. I like power. I like money. I like getting my own way. You know,
You're human.
I'm a
Yes.
human being, you know, right? Like we all are. And then, as Jung said, you have to know these things about yourself in order to know when to engage your self-interest and when not. Because the point is, when you're a therapist, the satisfaction that you get from the client is meant to be the money, right? So your client pays you, and that's what you get from your client. And, you know, that's great. And I'm, you know, we're all very appreciative of that. And my clients pay my mortgage, and that's fantastic, right? But I'm not there to get satisfaction from them by engaging in some kind of enactment where I become the kind of the moral, all-knowing therapist who's going to impose the correct moral viewpoint on the client and get them to see the light. That isn't what therapy is about. You know, critical theorists are very interested in power. And they're not wrong. They're not wrong to be interested in power. You know, there's power in the therapy room like there is anywhere else. You know, power is sometimes a useful lens and sometimes not, right? So for the therapist, you need to know your power in the room in order to be able to bracket it so that you can create an effective therapeutic alliance with your client, which, you know, yes, of course, they're coming to you because you've got some expertise, but fundamentally they've got expertise too. They've got expertise about themselves. You've got some ideas about the human condition and about what happens in the therapeutic process psychologically and relationally that kind of creates a kind of healing context. But the worst thing you can do is try and, well, not the worst thing, you know, many worse things. You can sleep with a client or hit them or engage in a business venture with them or whatever. But, you know, short of all of that, one of the worst things I think you can do is try and get your client to buy into your take on the world. Because your point is to help them heal and integrate. And part of healing and integrating is for them to come to their own conclusions about what it is that they need in life, what it is that life means to them. What does individuation look like to that person? I don't know what it looks like to that person. I'm pretty sure for most people it doesn't involve becoming a political activist. And if it does, that's fine. It's not. Again, I regard psychotherapy as a fundamentally amoral act, actually. It's not it's the morality of psychotherapy is in the nature of the activity about helping people heal. It's not in what you're doing in the room to impose a particular moral code, right? So the morality exists, but it exists in the structure of the activity rather than in the granularity of what you're trying to say. And I'm, you know, I'm not interested. I've worked with clients of all different political stripes. I've obviously got my own politics. Not necessarily share them here. I don't think it's that relevant. But I'm not there to try and change my clients' politics, right? If they've got a political commitment. But I'm not there to make them have a political or a moral commitment if they don't already have it. You know, it is.
But that requires you to subscribe to a certain, like you said, structure, to a certain frame, a frame that is built upon certain theoretical understanding of the nature of the psyche. So I appreciate your honesty when you say that you like power, but you've also adapted sufficiently well enough to appreciate that when you impose your power to some extent too far, you'll cause harm, and that's something you don't want. So there is an ethical sense that is also at play here, a respect that certain things are more important to you than my narcissistically imposing my will and my idea of the world, my power onto my environment, and to demand that my environment bend over backwards to accommodate what I demand it to be.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate that. But here I find that critical social justice adherents are so obsessed with power that they ignore alternative possibilities of why people engage socially. And the motivation for social engagement is not necessarily to impose power alone. our society would have been tyrannical and brutal and super primitive if power was the only reason for engaging with it. We also seek intimacy. That complicates interactions immediately. We also seek achievement, things outside of ourselves, the Uberwelt of the existentialists.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so maybe you can say something about that. So
Sure,
I'm just putting
absolutely.
it out there.
Absolutely so. I agree with you, Jaco. And of course, what critical social justice does, I think, is it flattens things.
Yes.
So you kind of, they're interested in real phenomena, right? But they're only interested in certain phenomena, as you say. And I make a point in the chapter that actually this is a kind of flattening process, that the people who are most drawn to this ideology, or at least the ideology itself encourages, I think, in people who are drawn to it, because I think the point is that actually often ideologies have people rather than people having ideologies. But I think what it sort of encourages is a kind of a rumination, a kind of an obsession on the darker factors of existence, right? So they're very interested in suffering, and they're very interested in sort of self-interest, I suppose. They say at the same time that there is a vast amount of suffering in the world, but then they also say that this isn't necessary. If only you adopted the correct understanding, i.e. our understanding, the more complicated, the more sophisticated ones, say not all of, but most of, a lot of this suffering would disappear. If you do the work of critical social justice, a great deal of suffering will disappear. Now, this is a sort of a sleight of hand, actually, because I think if one of the things we understand, I think, without elaborating often, is that suffering is not optional. Suffering is just a part of life. We'll suffer. So, both Jung and Freud, in their own different ways, talked about religion. Obviously, Jung was quite spiritual, Freud not so, but
right.
They both talked about religion as potentially, in a certain format, offering a kind of an escape from reality, an escape from suffering. Actually, suffering doesn't have to be eternal. In fact, when you die, you go to this land where there is no suffering. But what we had in the 20th century, I think, was ideologies like communism and fascism, and now in the 21st century, I think we're seeing it with critical social justice.
Yes.
And one of the points I make in the chapter, from the existential perspective, well, suffering's inevitable, right? Struggle is inevitable.
Right.
From the psychoanalytic perspective, here's another side of religion. There's a lot of thought about good and bad. Where does the good and bad lie, right? And of course, the idea maybe is that if you take up the right belief system, you can evade that kind of little nagging bit in the back of your head that says, "Oh, maybe you're not perfectly good." And that's why I talk about Klein.
Yes.
In the chapter, because she was somebody who talked a lot, sort of post-Freudian analyst who talked a lot about splitting and projection, and obviously a lot of the analysts talked about that, but she had a model which I think is particularly elegant, and I talk about it in the chapter, and people can read about it, and I explain it in kind of layman's terms. But the idea is that you can split off, you can split things into perfect good and perfect bad, black and white, and then lodge those ideas in different places, right? So the reality is, and this is something we learn, Klein would think, from when you get into the depressive position, from 6 months onwards, and we get a better understanding of it throughout life as we get older, right? That actually we're not squeaky clean, right? Any one of us as individuals, we're all pretty mixed. Success in life has required us to, I don't know, on a very everyday level, compete with jobs for other people. And, if we put their interests first, we wouldn't have got the job. But that means, we had to compete with somebody else and defeat them to get what we wanted. And that maybe upset the other person, and they had to go and find something else. success in life kind of demands things of us that might make us feel uncomfortable to a certain extent. And it might be therefore very, very tempting to take this idea of the mixed self and split it out. And that's one of the things that CSJ enables people to do, I think. It enables people to say, I'm really good because I abide by this sophisticated set of ideas. I'm really committed to decreasing the suffering of those who have less power, those who are marginalized. Look at me, I'm great. And that's something that they're saying to themselves as much as they are to other people, right? They're doing both, right? They're doing it to other people to get kind of plaudits and maybe kind of justify their roles in whatever job they've got or whatever. But it's also to kind of ease the nagging sense of doubt internally. Freud said we're pleasure-seeking creatures, right? Well, part of that is we want to avoid psychic discomfort, and rather than kind of doing the hard work that Freud and Jung would suggest, and Jung talks about kind of looking at the shadow, and then integrating the parts of ourselves that maybe we don't like so much with the parts that we do like, so that we can have a kind of more of a dynamic, integrated sense of self. It's quite tempting in a way to not do that hard work and to simply split off the parts of ourselves we don't like and put them into other people. Look at that person over there. He doesn't agree with critical social justice.
Yes.
Well, he must be a misogynist or a racist or an ableist.
Racist.
And that's more
white
comfortable.
supremacist.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of, here's the funny thing about CSJ, I think, is that it's politically sophisticated, right? It's got a lot of antecedents in the postmodernist movement, also certain kinds of ways of looking at Marxism, Gramsci, etc., etc. It's politically sophisticated, but psychologically it's extremely simplistic. So any of those of us who are involved in the psychological professions should be able to see this and critique it. So it's like, I'm interested that I know you Jaco, you've written some interesting articles on this, but one of the reasons I was kind of wanted to write this chapter is because when I was writing it, I've just been surprised by how little critique there is out there from the psychoanalytic perspective, or from a kind of therapeutic perspective. I'm not saying there's anything special about me, right? It's like I'm just a bog standard analyst, right? But not enough people are doing this work, and it's very easy to critique CSJ from within our perspectives. And fundamentally, I don't want this to be a political fight, right?
Why do you think that's not happening? That there's been so much, so much silence or quiet.
CSJ says some stuff which is not of itself untrue. The problem with it is how it's wielded, where the focus is put, how much emphasis is put on one thing rather than another. So I think some colleagues sort of maybe think that it's time to think more about sort of marginalized groups rather than those who are in a sort of more majoritarian position, if you like. So I think there's some kind of genuine sense that actually, well, no, we need to pay attention to these issues, and they're not wrong in that. But I also think that the sign of a healthy organism is one that sort of protects itself, that enables itself to kind of carry on, right? And
self-correct.
Absolutely. But I think what people are seeing here is that if you stand up and you say something, you have your position at your university threatened, or you might lose your job, or you might be thrown off social media where you promote your practice, or whatever it might be. So, I think there's a certain amount of people feeling that discretion is the better part of valor. But the problem with that is if not enough people kind of stand up and say something, then you end up with the profession becoming hollowed out. And that's why I felt I wanted to write this. Because otherwise, what you end up with is this flattening, right? So psychotherapy becomes flattened, just like the rest of the culture becomes flattened. So that rather than psychotherapy being a rather mysterious, in many ways, practice, I think, but a practice with many aspects to it that essentially are involved in the promotion of individual well-being, personal growth, development, the movement towards individuation, self-actualization, as Maslow would have put it. And of course, you never get there, right? It's always a journey. But
Sure.
but the idea of it being both a healing profession, and then, as I think Jung would particularly have seen it, as sort of a growth profession. It's not just about healing; it's about going beyond healing into growth and empowerment. But rather than thinking about this as an individual thing that you help individual clients with so that they find their path, what you end up with is a kind of obsession with the power lens and an obsession with these questions of identity, power, and privilege. Now, obviously, I have a wide range of different types of clients, just like all colleagues do, right? And I mean, I don't think there's I'm always interested in these things, right? I don't think there's a single ethnic minority client, for instance, that I've had where I haven't at some point talked about, well, what's it like to be talking about X, Y, or Z with a white guy? Because that's a thing, right? And it's
right.
sort of,
and if it's salient in their experience, then we explore that.
But that's also too. That's a natural part of your conversation. I guess why that just struck something for me. That naturally occurs where those questions come up, and I think that even in my own experience as a client or patient, however you want to label that, the artificialness, okay, of this whole frame of critical social justice that's sort of injected, it wasn't an organic question for my therapist at the time to ask me what it was like to be a Middle Eastern woman. When my conversation, what I brought into the room is, oh my God, I keep dating all these people that are bad for me, kind of this thought, why do I date these toxic men? And after 10 years of being with this one therapist, it enters the room because the politics or this frame that we injected, he sort of felt in a sense that, oh my gosh, I've got to pay attention to that. I'm a white man seeing this woman who's, this person of color. I better say something about this. So it wasn't something that came up organically, where that organic conversation would have led to a lot of places of unlocking all sorts of different, unconscious thoughts, feelings, actions. It was artificial and it was injected agenda based. And I think that's the big piece. So when you're talking about it, Ben, it seems like you're talking about it from a naturally, it sort of unfolds, and then there is a point to bring it up or to focus on it, right? But that's what the analytics community is doing, but you don't lead with it. It's not
precisely. It's not now, because this is the thing, actually. It's something that I think I've discussed. Difference is something I discuss with my clients, right? But it never, not once has it been the core of the work. That's because people come to psychotherapy as individuals with individual problems, right? So yes, it's part of the work. Difference is part of the work, and how people feel about that. And I think certainly my experience of working with clients who are not white is that most of them have some kind of experience or feelings about racism, but it's not the core of what they're coming to do their work on. And this I think is very important, because if you assume that this stuff about identity and power is the core of the work, personally, I would say that you are not helping your clients to grow, right? You're not helping your clients to develop with the issues that they've really come to think about. Now, obviously, as the therapist, you have the client has an idea. The client comes and says, well, I think my problem is about this. And then you have a chat about that. And over the weeks and months, as the therapist, you start to think, well, actually, I think there's something else going on here as well. So the therapist, it's interplay, right? The therapist has ideas, and we kind of exchange, and we think together about what might be going on between us and between the client and their relationships in the external world. But this artificial politicization of our Yeah, it's artificial. That's it, right? And it does our profession no service, and it does our clients no service. We need to be open to talking about the topics that are raised by CSJ, no question. And I would say in a non-defensive way.
Sure.
You know, I don't personally apparently I sort of as a white man, I don't particularly identify myself in those terms, but as a white man, I don't have any kind of I don't have any racial guilt, I suppose. I think when I was younger, I had class guilt, racial guilt, sex guilt. I was sort of ashamed to be a man, and so on and so forth. And part of getting to be a good therapist is that you deal with the stuff, you look at it, you think about how it might impact how you relate to other people, and then you move through it, right? It's like it doesn't serve your clients to keep kind of flagellating yourself. It doesn't serve your clients to keep coming back to these questions, although these questions are useful and important. I'm not saying we shouldn't look at them at all,
Right.
but it's completely flat, right? And people now, I know, they're being taught in trainings that this is the core of the work. And
My goodness.
We have this beautiful profession with such kind of profound richness, the capacity to kind of help humanity so much, and it's being kind of it's being degraded, it's being dissolved,
hijacked, captured.
But the
absolutely. Go ahead,
Jaco. Yes, that is the worry, and you know, from a Bionian sense, and I know you did not write from a Bionian sense. It is this concept of knowledge versus okay versus negative K, where is this knowledge salient and relevant to this person's own discovery of their own wounds, of the truth of their own individuation process, or is this a short circuit? Is this a psychic retreat? And oftentimes ideology, whether it's religious ideology or non-religious ideology, can serve as a cheap and a simple explanation, but it doesn't serve as a source of actual insight. That's a negative K according to the Bionian framework. And that is my worry about these radicalizing ideologies, that they give an explanation, but it's not the truth. Again, Bion speaks of O as the truth. It is not that person. It's not what that person is necessary to, it's not what's necessary for that person to discover, to grow into, to be confronted with. It is too shallow. It is too simplistic. It is artificial. It is imposed as opposed to generated and discovered, which is my biggest worry of our profession.
Well, I think, you know, to add to that, what I used to say, and I guess, you know, there may be different, you know, thoughts about this, but your client is only going to be able to go as deep as you are able to yourself as a therapist take them.
Yeah.
That's
contained
yes.
position.
Yes. So all of these deeper places, yes, that is directly connected to the depth in which you can go with your client, that container, and to peel the layers. This social justice, though, when we're in there, where are we as therapists? We're right here on the surface. It's a surface answer. We're not going to the deeper places. It's relative, right, to how deep we can go with ourselves, how deeply we can go with them, how we're able to guide or open the door, whatever it is, lay it out.
I think that's a really important point, Christine. And one of the points that I sort of make in the chapter is that this kind of, you know, the human condition, the human experience, human nature, however you want to think about it, is a very rich thing, but a scary thing as well. It's got kind of it's got majesty and it's got terror within it, right?
Yes.
Every human being, we contain everything. We contain the whole universe, really, in a sense, right? And then when you make everything about politics, this sort of total politicization of the culture and the attempt to do that to our profession, this is exactly what it does, Christine. I agree with you. So it keeps everything on the surface. It's a way of avoiding psychological discomfort. And how is it that you grow? The only way that you grow is through the discomfort, right? It doesn't.
Right. And
This is
isn't
available
it
to
true? Isn't it true then that these days whatever causes discomfort is regarded as harmful?
Yes.
Look, Ben, this is fascinating stuff, and I can feel within myself, but I can also see it within you, and also with Christine, that we are hungry to have these kinds of discussions as psychologists, as psychotherapists,
Yes.
and to have the necessary critical discussion of these phenomena. And look, we can carry on for hours if we didn't have these time constraints. I want to thank you for your contribution, and I appreciate your being one of our colleagues and being part of the CTA team. And we will hopefully have some more of these discussions as well, Ben. So keep up the good work. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so
And
much,
hopefully
Ben.
we'll meet soon enough.
Such a pleasure.
Thanks,
Thank
Jaco.
you very much.
All right.
Really appreciate it.